All right, Rabbi Sai, we have some catching up to do on DAF Tzadi Vav Amid Beis, and this will go quite quickly, even though it's somewhat complicated, but it's a very quick Gemara. We were learning yesterday about the din of Temura of a Korban Pesach, but the way that the Mishnah presents itself is as follows. If I have a Mosar Pesach, which means I have an animal that was lost and then it's left over, which means I had to set aside a Paschal lamb, it got lost, so I took a replacement lamb, and then I take a third lamb, and I say this animal is the Temura of the replacement animal. So then the Mishnah had said that it depends on the status of both the Temura animal and the Mosar Pesach. It depends, when was the animal found? Was the animal found after the Shechita of the actual Korban Pesach or before the Shechita of the actual Korban Pesach? So we had a machlokes yesterday, which is going to resurface again today between Rabbi and Rabbi Zera. Rabbi says that the trigger point is the Shechita itself. If the animal was found before the Shechita, and I shech the replacement animal instead of the lost animal, so then the lost animal is what is called dachui. It is precluded. And therefore the Temura animal that is in exchange for that lost animal is also called dachui, and they have to be yira ad sheyistayev. The animal has to graze, and you sell it until it develops a mum, and then you sell it, and the proceeds go to purchase other karbanos. If, however, the animal is found after the shechita, so then the animal is not called dachui, and the animal is brought as a korban shlomim. That's according to Rabbi. According to Rabbi Zera, it is not dependent upon the actual shechita, but rather the zman shechita. Which is the chatzos hayom of Erev Pesach. If the animal is found before chatzos hayom, and I don't shecht it after chatzos, then the animal is called dachui, and its temura is also called dachui. Therefore, it has to graze until it develops a mum and be sold. If, however, the animal is found after chatzos, according to Rabbi Zera, the animal is not dachui, and therefore it can be brought as a shlomim by itself. Now, if you have that in your head, then we can go weiter, and it should be smooth sailing, more or less, even though it's somewhat complicated. Amar Rabba, lo shanu ela shenimtza achar shchita v'heimir bo achar shchita. Avol nimtza koidem shchita v'heimir bo achar shchita tumuraso mikoach kedusha dechuya ka'asa v'lo kareva. So Rabba says that the only time that we treat the Temura animal as a shlomim is if the lost animal is found after the shechita of the replacement animal, and the Temura declaration takes place after the shechita as well, because the Temura is done on the lost animal. Since the lost animal was found after shechita, so then the Temura animal acquires the same status as the lost animal. And therefore, since the lost animal was not dachui, the Temura animal is not dachui. If, however, the lost animal is found before the shechita, and the Temura declaration is done after the shechita, you might have thought that since the Temura animal was not dachui, it was not in its state of kachim at the time when it could become dachui, and therefore the Temura animal should not acquire that stigma of being dachui. Nevertheless, the chiddush is that the animal is still called a dachui because it's coming from the koach, coming from the strength of a dachui animal. It's coming as an exchange for a dachui animal, so therefore it too is dachui, even though its Temura status only inheres after the shechita. So Eisvei Abaye. So Abaye challenges that. Abaye says, Im Kesef. Now, in order to understand this brisa, we have to appreciate that the Torah in Parshas Vayikra gives us all of the laws of the Shlomim. And when it gives us all the laws of the Shlomim, it says, Im min hatzon. If you're going to bring an animal from tzon. Now, tzon is a generic term which implies sheep and goats. So the second paragraph of that parsha says, V'im eiz karbano, if your korban is a goat. So the first paragraph should be, by process of elimination, talking about sheep. It is therefore not necessary for the Torah to say explicitly im keves, so therefore the words im keves are superfluous. That's im kesef. So the question therefore that the brisa asks is, what is the purpose of those two words? Mata mulomar, im kesef, L'rabos temuras hapesach acher hapesach shekarei v'shlamim. This is coming to teach me that not only is a regular shlamim brought as a shlamim, but sometimes a temura for a korban pesach is also brought as a shlamim. So hey chidami. Now the question that the Gemara asks is, what is this brisa? What kind of temura of a korban pesach is the brisa talking about? If it's talking about a standard case where the lost animal is found after shechita and the temura takes place after shechita, well then obviously neither the origin animal nor the temura animal was ever dachui. So why would you even need a pasuk to tell you that? That seems to be intuitive even without a pasuk. So elalav shenimsa koidem shechita vehemir bo achar shechita. So rather, what must the brisa be addressing? Where the lost animal is found before shechita, so the lost animal is dachui, but the temura act does not take place until after shechita, so the temura animal is not dachui, and therefore it can be brought as a shlamim. This is a tiyuv to Rabbi, who says that in such a case, both the lost animal and its temura animal are considered to be dachui, and therefore they have to be yirad sheyistoy, they have to graze. So the Gemara says, lo, that's not a raya. La'olam shenimtza achar shechita vehemir bo achar shechita ukra asmachta bi'alma. So the Gemara says, no, you're misreading the brisa. The brisa is not telling you that you need a pasuk to tell you this halacha. Really, the brisa is talking about the standard case where the lost animal is found after shechita and the temura takes place after shechita. And the truth is, you don't need a pasuk to tell you that. It's obvious without a pasuk, and the pasuk is therefore just an asmachta. It's a rabbinic mnemonic device to help you remember the halacha. So then taka, the question then becomes, so what taka is the purpose of these words im kesev? What do those words actually come for? Because they are superfluous. So the Gemara says, L'chidatanya, I have another brisa for that. The brisa says kesev, so the word kesev, which is extra, what is its purpose? L'rabos es ha-pesach la'aliyah. It's coming to tell me that the tail is part of the emurim that is offered on the mizbeach for the korban pesach. Let me just explain that. The Torah normally, by other karbanos, specifies what parts of the innards of the animal are supposed to be taken and placed on top of the mizbeach for burning, and which parts of the animal are meant to be eaten. By the korban pesach, the Torah never specifies what the emurim are, what those innards are. And so I need a pasuk by shlamim to teach me that whatever applies to the shlamim applies to the korban pesach. So if I bring a sheep or lamb as my korban pesach, just like by the shlamim I have to place the tail of the lamb on the mizbeach, so too by the korban pesach I have to place the tail of the lamb on the mizbeach. So kishehu omer, that's what the word kesev is coming to teach me. Kishehu omer im kesev. So why is the word im necessary? L'rabos pesach she'aver shnasa u'shlamim haboim machmas pesach l'chol mitzvah shlamim sheton smichon esachem tufas chazei v'shog. That the word extra im is coming to add an additional halacha. That whenever I have a korban shlamim that is being brought together with or in unison with the korban pesach, Rashi says that either means that you're dealing with a mosar pesach animal, a lamb that is extra from the korban pesach and therefore is brought as a shlamim, or you're dealing with a korban chagiga that is brought with the korban shlamim, that in both of those cases you treat it as a regular korban shlamim, and therefore you need to do smicha, press down on the animal, you need the libations, you need the waving of the chest and the thigh, like every korban shlamim. And then the brisa continues, and this is really parenthetical to our discussion, but it's part of the brisa, so the Gemara cites it. Ucheshehu omer v'im eis hifsika inya. The next paragraph, which talks about if your shlamim is a goat, that is v'im eis. So the letter vav tells you that v'im, but if it is a goat, it means to tell you that the halacha by goats is different from the halacha for sheep. And libet el ha'eis she'ein ton aliyah. That this teaches you that when you place the emurim of a goat on the altar, you do not place the tail. The tail is part of the consumable product of the korban. So, ika demasni la aresha. So, up until now, we've seen the shita of Rabbi is that the only time that a tumuras pesach can be brought as a shlamim is if both the lost animal is found after shechita and the tumura of that lost animal takes place after the shechita. Okay? However, Ika Damasni La Aresha, some learn that no, Rabbi's statement was just the opposite, that he's coming to be lenient because it's going on the first part of the Mishnah. HaPesach shenimtza kodem shchitas HaPesach yira ad sheyistoi v'yimalcher v'yavi b'dam of shlomim v'chein temurasa. The Mishnah had said that if you have a korban Pesach which got lost, the lamb got lost, and then you find it before shechita, it has to graze. You cannot bring it as a korban shlamim unto itself. Plus, any temura of that found animal, the lost animal that was found, also has to graze. It cannot be brought as a shlamim. So Amar Rava lo shanu elo shenimsa kodem shchita vehimir bar kodem shchita avol nimsa kodem shchita vehimir bo acher shchita to muraso kareva shlamim. And on that Rabbi says, but that's only true if the animal was found before shchita and the declaration of temura was done before the shchita. But if the animal was found before shchita and the declaration of temura was done after shchita, since the declaration of temura took place after there was the possibility of dichoy, so then the temura animal can be brought as a shlamim. My time, what's the reason? Ki kava shchita midi dechazi le midi lo chazi le lo kava. The answer is that what does shchita do? Shchita creates dichoy for any animal that is kachim at that moment that is not being brought as the korban pesach. Since the declaration of temura does not take place until after the shchita, that lamb, that is the temura lamb, was never kachim, and therefore was never in the parsha of being dachui to begin with. And therefore, since it was never in the parsha of being dachui, it can be brought as a korban shlamim. So Esvei Abaye challenges Rabbi, and he brings it from a different brisa now, im kesev. A very similar brisa which analyzes the two extra words im kesev in the parsha of the sheep shlamim. Mat hamulomar. What do those two words come to teach? L'rabos temuras hapesach achar hapesach shekrei v'shlamim. It's coming to tell you that if you have a temura of a korban pesach, that it could be brought as a korban shlamim. So yachol af lifnei ha-pesach kain, you might think that a temura of a korban pesach that is made temura even before the korban pesach is brought could also be used as a shlamim. Talmud lomar hu karei ve'in temuras ha-pesach kareva. So this is a different pasuk. This is a pasuk of va'amartem zevach pesach hu l'Hashem. You shall declare that this is the paschal offering. But the word hu is a miyut, that only the korban pesach itself can act as the korban pesach, but the temura of the korban pesach cannot be brought as a korban. So heichi dami. So now Abaye says, well, let's analyze this brisa. What kind of temura of Pesach are we talking about? If we're talking about a case where the pasuk is coming to exclude a temura animal from being a korban, if you're telling me that it's talking about a case where the lost animal was found before the shechita of the korban pesach, and its temura was declared before the shechita, so then that's obvious. You don't need a pasuk to tell me that temura animal cannot be brought as a korban. It's totally dachui. So elalav shenimsa koydem shechita vehemir bo achar shechita. So rather, the only reason why you need the word hu in the pasuk to exclude a temura animal from being a korban pesach is in unusual case where what? Where the lost animal was found before shechita, but the declaration of temura did not take place until after shechita. And nevertheless, the Torah still says who? That it is precluded from being brought as a korban. So what do you see? That such an animal cannot be brought as a shlamim. Not like Rabbi says, to yufta de Rabba to yufta. So this is a refutation of the second version of Rabba. So therefore, the Gemara's conclusion is both according to the first version and the second version, is that if the animal is found before the shechita, and then you make a temura of that found animal, so then that temura is still dachui, even if the temura declaration was done after the shechita. So Amar Shmuel. Now Shmuel makes a very interesting statement, which he creates a correlation between the laws of korban chatas and the laws of korban pesach. Shmuel says, Kol shebechatos mesa, bepesach korev shlamim. Anytime a korban chatos has to die, then its corresponding korban pesach can be brought as a shlamim. You don't need it. You don't need the animal to graze. V'chol shebechatas roa, and anytime you have a korban chatas animal that has to graze and develop a mum and has to be sold and cannot itself be brought as a korban, then the same halacha applies by the korban pesach animal, the pesach nami roa. Now, it's important to clarify that Chazal establish, at least according to Rabbi, that there is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that we have 5 chatos animals that have to die. What does that mean? It means when I can't bring the animal itself as a korban chatos for one of 5 reasons, the animal has to die. This is according to Rabbi, and Rabbi says that it's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. What are the 5? So Rashi tells us what the 5 are. So one is called Vlad chatos, where I have a cow that was designated as a korban chatos. It becomes pregnant and has an offspring, so that animal cannot be used as a korban, that offspring, and it cannot be done, nothing can be done with it. It has to be put in a barn, and you just wait till it starves to death and dies. The next animal is called Tumuras chatas. When I make a declaration of Tumura on a korban chatas, the Tumuras chatas dies. Chatas shemesu be'aleha, number 3, is that if I have a korban chatas that was designated animal for a chatas and the owner who has to bring the chatas dies, that animal has to die. Number 4 is chatas sheniskapru be'aleha al yedei ha'acheres sha'avda. So if you have an animal that was lost, designated as a korban chatas, and it was lost, and then you designated another animal to be brought in its stead, and then you find the lost animal, so then that animal also has to die. And the final one is chatas that she'avra shnasa. Number 5 is if the animal becomes too old to be brought as a korban chatas, because the Torah places an age limit on the age of the animal for it to be brought as a korban chatas. So under certain circumstances, each one of these 5 chatas animals cannot be brought as a korban, nor can it be grazed. It just has to die. So in all of those cases, the Gemara basically says if you have a corresponding case by korban pesach, where the animal is designated as a pesach in the same circumstances, then the animal is brought as a shlomim. It's only when you have a case where the korban chatas is allowed to graze do we say that the corresponding case in korban pesach is there too, the animal has to graze. Now, we're going to see some applications of this momentarily. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says, Eina pesach karev shlomim ela shenimtza achar shchita. Abal kodem shchita lo. Rabbi Yochanan says that no, a korban pesach can only, a korban pesach animal can only be brought as a shlomim if it is found after shchita, which is what we had said previously according to Rabbi. But if it's found before Shechita, it cannot be brought as a korban shlomim because it's dachui. So, maskef la Rav Yosef, uchlalahu. So Rav Yosef challenges Shmuel's statement to correlate korban chatas to korban pesach. You mean to tell me that this is the standard rule? V'harei chatas she'avra shnasa dilaraya azla. What about a korban chatas which has become too old? Now, even though Rashi had mentioned that that's one of the 5 animals that dies, that's only according to Rebbe. But according to the Chachamim, such an animal grazes until it develops a mum, and you sell it. So, the Amar of Shimon ben Lakish, Chatas Shavar Shanasa, Rowan Osa Ki Ilu Hi Omedes Beveisa Kvaros, Viroa. And Reish Lakish had said that if you have an animal that becomes too old, it was designated as a chatas and it becomes too old before you had a chance to bring it, you view it as if it's in a cemetery. Now this is just a figure of speech. What you basically means is that you have to let it graze. You can't let the Kohen take it and shecht it. The Kohen, it's taboo to the Kohen, just as if it was standing in a cemetery. And therefore the animal just has to be allowed to graze until it develops a mum. And by contrast, the ilu b'pesach ki hagavna kar shlamim. Whereas if you have a leftover animal from the korban pesach, or an animal that just becomes too old, the halacha is that animal is brought as a korban shlamim. So you see that Shmuel's rule doesn't apply. By chatas you have a rule that it has to graze, and by the korban pesach you have a rule that it's brought as a shlamim. That's not Shmuel's rule. Shmuel's rule was, if it grazes by chatas, it grazes by Pesach. If it dies by chatas, it's brought as a shlomim by Pesach. So how do you reconcile it? Titania kesef l'rabos es Pesach la'alya. And how do we know that if it's too old, the halacha is that it's brought as a shlomim? Because of that brisa that we saw in the previous amud. Because it says that the word kesef in the pasuk by shlomim is coming to include that you have to bring the tail of the korban Pesach as part of the emurim on the mizbeach, and kishu Kishu Omer Im Kesav, an extra word Im in that pasuk is L'Rabbos es HaPesach she'avar shnaso u'shlamim haboyim machmas beis l'chol mitzvah shlamim shetunin smicha nesachim tenufas chazei v'shok. The reason why it says the word Im is to tell you one of the things that it's coming to include is that when the Korban Pesach animal becomes too old, then it's brought as a shlamim, and all of the laws of shlamim apply to it: the smicha, the nesachim, and the waving of the parts. And then finally, the Brisa says, "Kishu Omer im eis hifsekain and liman alei shein ton aliyah." And the next paragraph, which talks about goats, the reason why it separates itself from the laws of the sheep is because goats, the goat tail is not placed as one of the emurim on the mizbeach. But the bottom line is that what this Brisa teaches me is that if the animal is too old that was designated for Korban Pesach, it's brought as a shlamim. And according to Reish Lakish, if an animal is too old for a chatas, then it's told to graze. So Shmuel's rule does not apply. Amar leiki ka Amar Shmuel ba'avudin b'dechuyin lo Amar. So the Gemara's first answer, or the Gemara's answer is that you misunderstood Shmuel's statement. Shmuel was not addressing all cases of Korban Chatas to correlate to all cases of Korban Pesach animals, but rather he was saying only in the case where an animal is lost, a Chatas designated animal is lost, its halacha corresponds to a Korban Pesach designated animal that is lost and then refound. That's where the halachas correspond to each other. That if it dies by a Korban Chatas, then it is brought as a shlamim for a Korban Pesach. If it has to graze as a Korban Chatas, then it has to graze for a Korban Pesach as well. So the Gemara challenges that too. Va'avud mi mishkachasla. 1 second. What kind of case of lost animals are we talking about by a Korban Chatas? V'harei avuda bishas hafrasha d'larabanan d'laraya azla. That there's a halacha that according to the Chachamim, if the animal is lost at the time, if by a Korban Chatas designated animal gets lost, and then you replace it with animal B, and before you have a chance to offer animal B, you find animal A. So in that situation, the Chachamim say that animal A grazes. It doesn't have to die. Ditznan hifrish chataso va'avda v'hifrish acheres tachteha v'nimtzeis harishona v'arishdein omdos. So there's the Mishnah says that if you lose animal A and you replace it with animal B designated as a chatas, and then you find animal A, and now you have two animals standing in front of you, echas mehen tikare v'ushniya tamus divrei Rabbi. Only according to Rabbi do we say that the animal that you don't bring as the chatas has to die, and the other animal is brought as the chatas. But the chachamim omrim ein chatas meisa ela shenimtzeis la'achar sheniskapru ba'olim hakodem sheniskapru ba'olim roa. But the chachamim disagree, and the chachamim say that no, if you find the lost animal before you offer the korban chatas, so then that animal grazes, and then you just sell it after it develops a mum. But and only when it's found after the bringing of the replacement chatas do we say that the animal has to die. So now the ilu b'pesach, but by the Korban Pesach that's not the case. Heicha de'avad v'nimtza achar chatzos kodem shchita karev shlamim. Whereas by the Korban Pesach the corresponding case does not shtim. Remember, according to the Chachamim, by the Korban Chatas such an animal grazes as long as you find it before the offering of the Korban Chatas. Whereas by the Korban Pesach, if let's say your original designated lamb gets lost and then you find it only after Chatzos, again, according to Rebbe Zera, who says that once you find it after Chatzos, it's not called dachoy, right? And therefore, you're allowed to bring that newly found lamb as a shlamim. So you see that whereas by Chatzos it has to graze, by Korban Pesach, the corresponding case, it's brought as a shlamim. So Reb Shmuel's rule does not apply. The Gemara answers, Shmuel kerebi svirale da amar avuda lemisa azla. The Gemara answers, well, Shmuel paskins like Rebbe in that previous brisa. What does Rebbe say? Rebbe says that in both cases, both when you find the lost chatas before the bringing of the replacement and after the bringing of the replacement animal, in both cases, when you find that chatas animal, it has to die. And so therefore it works out that by the chatas the animal has to die, and by the Korban Pesach the animal is brought as a shlamim. So Shmuel's rule holds. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. V'hakol avuda l'Rebbe mesa. But 1 second, any lost animal according to Rebbe has to die, whether you find it before you bring the chatas replacement or after you bring the chatas replacement. V'ilu b'pesach heicha da'avad kodem chatzos v'nimtza kodem chatzos roa. But 1 second, But we know that even according to Rabbi Zera, who says that the trigger point is the arrival of Chatzos Hayom, but Rabbi Zera agrees that if the animal is found before Chatzos Hayom, then what's the halacha of that found animal? That's called dachui. And if it's called dachui, then the animal has to graze. You can't bring it as a shlamim. So there is a scenario where, according to Rebbe, by the korban chatas, the animal has to die, and the corresponding case of the korban pesach, where you find the korban pesach before chatzos, it has to graze. It can't be brought as a shlamim. So once again, Shmuel's rule does not apply. Answers the Gemara, kodem chatzos lav avudhu kidarava. The Gemara answers that no. According to Shmuel, when you find the lost lamb before chatzos, that's not called lost. You only when is something called lost? When you need it and you don't know where it is. But when you lose an animal and then you find it before you actually need it, then it was never called lost to begin with. Since I find the animal before chatzos when it's the zman of bringing the korban pesach, so then that's not called a lost animal. And therefore, Shmuel's rule still applies. Shmuel's basically saying that when you have a lost chatas animal that has to die, and a corresponding lost paschal lamb, which means by definition that it's found only after chatzos, and therefore it was never dachui, you bring that corresponding paschal lamb as a korban shlamim.
But he designated another animal before he found it, before chatzos, no?
Yeah, you designated another animal, and then you find...
lost. That's why...
What?
So it would be lost. You'd already designated another animal.
Yeah, no, but if you find the first animal before chatzos, it makes no difference whether you designated another animal. It's not called lost because it's just called a Mosar Pesach. It's called an extra animal that you designated because if you would have had bitachon, you would have found it. You wouldn't have had to designate another animal. The Amar Rava, and Rava basically says that this is the rule. Aveda slaila lav shmo aveda elaroa lav shmo aveda. Rava says that if you lose an animal at night when you can't bring a korban, that animal's never called lost to begin with. It's only called lost when you can bring it as a korban and you don't know where it is. In the same vein, if you lose an animal before chatzos and you find it before chatzos, it's never called lost. So now the Gemara says, okay, now wait a minute. If according to Rebbe, all chatas animals that are lost and are found die, so what about the second part of Shmuel's statement? Shmuel says that in any case where a lost chatas designated animal is roa, the corresponding korban pesach case animal is also roa. Under what circumstances, according to Rebbe, is there ever such a case where the animal grazes instead of dying? So, Kida Rebbe Oshia, there is such a case. The Amar Rebbe Oshia, hifrish shtei chatos leachrayus, niskaper be'echas mehenu shniyatira. Rebbe Oshia talks about the following case. Not when you lose an animal, but let's say a person wants to hedge his bets and take an insurance policy. He has to bring a korban chatas, so he says, you know what, I'll set aside two animals. Just in case something happens to one of the animals, I'll have the other animal. It's not that one gets lost and he has to replace it. Both of them are in front of him the whole time. In that situation, whichever one you use is the chatas, and whichever one you don't use, that one has to graze. So frek the Gemara, wait a minute, if that's the case of grazing for the korban chatas, veha ilu bepesach ki haygavna karev shlamim. But in that corresponding case, we know that anytime you have Mosar Pesach, that's brought as a korban shlamim. So Shmuel's rule, once again, does not apply. Here you have a case where by the chatas it's roa, and by the korban Pesach it's brought as a shlamim, and it's not roa. So how do you reconcile that? Ela Shmuel kerebi Shimon svirale. So the Gemara says you have to say that not only does Shmuel hold like Rebbe, but he holds even more than Rebbe. Shmuel holds like Reb Shimon, who holds that an animal always, leftover korban chatas animal always dies, even if you set it aside as an insurance policy from the inception. The Amar Chamesh Chatos Mesos. So, because Reb Shimon is of the opinion that halacha l'Moshe miSinai, there are 5 chatas animals that always die, and one of them is anytime you have a leftover korban chatas. It doesn't matter whether it was lost, it doesn't matter whether it was originally designated as an insurance policy. In all cases, the chatas animal dies. And therefore, that's why Shmuel could say that whenever a chatas animal dies, the corresponding korban pesach is brought as a shlamim. The Gemara says, v'haroa l'Reb Shimon less like klal. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, how could Shmuel's second statement ever hold? Because Shmuel's second part of the statement was that anytime you have a case of a korban chatas animal which is roa, the corresponding korban pesach animal is roa as well. According to Reb Shimon, there never is a case of a leftover korban chatas animal that's roa. The Gemara says, you're right. Shmuel nami chada ka'amar, kol shebechatas meisa bepesach karev shlamim. You're right, says the Gemara. No question, you're right. Really, Shmuel only made one statement. We incorrectly extrapolated from that statement something that Shmuel never said. Shmuel simply said that whenever you have a chatas animal that dies, its corresponding paschal animal is brought as a shlamim. That's all he said. Because according to Shmuel, who holds like Reb Shimon, there is no but if it's a korban chatas animal that's roa. There's no such case. So the Gemara says, Umay kamashmalan. So Taka, what is Shmuel coming to teach? What's the big chiddush over here? The Gemara answers, I'll tell you why. Lafuki mid Rabbi Yochanan. It's coming to exclude Rabbi Yochanan shita do Amar ein haPesach karev shlamim el shenimtza acher shchita val kodem shchita lo. Rabbi Yochanan had made a statement which is like Rabba of yesterday, which is that what is the trigger point to determine whether a paschal lamb is dachui or not dachui? The shchita itself. If you find the animal before shchita, the animal is called dachui and it has to be roa. If you find the animal after shchita, then the animal is not dachui and it's brought as a shlamim. So alma shchita kava. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's the shchita itself which is the trigger point. Kamash malon chatzos kava. And comes along Shmuel to say, no, it's not like Rabba and Rabbi Yochanan say, I hold like Rabbi Zera, that we saw yesterday, who says that it's chatzos, the arrival of chatzos, which is the trigger point. If it's the arrival of chatzos, which is the trigger point, then it turns out that if an animal is found after chatzos, it's not called dachui, it's not called precluded, and therefore the animal is brought as a shlamim, and basically that's really the only case of avud. The only case of avud, as we've established according to Shmuel, is when you find the animal after chatzos. And the chiddush that Shmuel is coming to teach you is that any time you find an animal after chatzos, it's not called dachui. Just like a korban chatas has to die under all circumstances, so too a korban pesach animal that was lost and found after chatzos is always brought as a korban shlamim. Lishna achrina. And now the Gemara basically, we've exhausted this whole discussion, but for finality, the Gemara is going to tell us that there's a slightly different version of this whole discussion that leads us to the same destination. So just keep in mind, we're not changing our conclusions here, we're just presenting it in a slightly different language. It says, V'ilu b'Pesach heicha da'avad v'nimtza achar chatzos kodem shchita yikarev shlamim. The Gemara had asked this question. Remember, the Gemara had asked the question, which is, how can you tell me that Shmuel's rule holds that any time a korban chatas animal grazes, a korban pesach animal also grazes? What about the case of an animal that was lost and was found before the korban chatas replacement animal was brought as a korban chatas? There the chachamim hold that the chatas animal that was lost has to graze, whereas by the korban pesach, if the animal is found after chatzos, is brought as a shlamim. That was the Gemara's question, right? So Shmuel kerabba svirale. So the Gemara in this version says that Shmuel holds like Rabba, who says the Omar shchita kava. He says that, no, he doesn't hold like Rebbe Zera, he holds like Rabba, who says that shchita is the trigger point. And since, therefore, if you find the animal after chatzos but before shchita, then it's the same halacha, that it is roa. Just like by a korban chatas that is found before the shchita, the animal is roa, so too if you find the lost paschal lamb before shchita, the animal has to be roa as well, because it's called dachui. Not like Rebbe Zera, but rather like Rabba. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, v'hamitikama Rebbe Yochanan Allah, Eina Pesach Karev Shlamim Elosh Nimsa Acha Shchita Val Kodem Shchita Lo Alma Shchita Kava Michlal Dushmul Savar Chatzos Kava. The Gemara says, but wait a minute. Then what is Rabbi Yochanan coming to say? Rabbi Yochanan seems like he's disagreeing with Shmuel. If you're telling me that Shmuel holds like Rabba, that Shchita is the trigger point, Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says, I hold that Shchita is the trigger point. But if Shmuel also holds like Rabba that Shchita is the trigger point, how can Rabbi Yochanan be coming to argue with him and saying, no, I hold that Shchita is the trigger point? It means that they're saying exactly the same thing. So Ella Shmuel kerebi svirale, but rather, says the Gemara, you're right. Shmuel holds like Rebbe Zera, that Chatzos is the trigger point. But he holds like Rebbe, who says that what? Who says that even if you find the lost Chatas animal before you shech the replacement Chatas animal, that Chatas animal has to die. The found Chatas animal has to die. And just Similarly, the Korban Pesach that's found after Chatzos has to be brought as is brought as a Korban Shlamim. Da'amar avuda lamisa azla. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. V'hakol avudin l'Rebbi Mason v'il Pesach heichadav kodem Chatzos v'nimsa kodem Chatzos roa. But 1 second. But I can give you a case where the Chatas animal dies, whereas the corresponding Korban Pesach lamb has to be roa. In what case? Where you find the lamb, the lost lamb, before Chatzos. And in that case, the lamb has to graze because it's called dachui, even according to Reb Zera. So the Gemara says, "Koydem chatzos lav obadhu kasaver chatzos kava." The Gemara answer is no. According to Shmuel, that's not called lost. If you find the lamb before chatzos, it was never lost, and therefore he holds that the trigger point is chatzos, like Rabbi Zera says. If you find it after, what's the definition of lost? That you find it after chatzos. In such a situation, the animal is brought as a shlomim, and the corresponding case by chatos, according to Rabbi, is that the korban chatos animal has to die. And this is where we'll hold it for today. You have a wonderful yantif and a guten kvittel. Boy, if you were able to follow that, you're brilliant.